For the life of Jim Bellows, a remarkable human being, and to celebrate the gift of his life, which has touched so many of us, and I suppose vast numbers of people well beyond our calculation. And to Jim's family, we want to express our solidarity in both the strange junction of loss and gratitude. At the beginning of the liturgy, there is this quotation by the Apostle Paul: "While we live, we are always being given up to death." They are somber words, but they are a reminder, then, that for us all, the question really isn't whether we shall die, for we must, necessarily how or when. Rather, the question that is posed for every one of us in those words is this: how then shall we live? This is the question posed by the consciousness of our own tenement. And to this basic, most fundamental question of human existence, Jim Bellows gave his answer, and it was his life. It was an affirmation of all that makes our life worthwhile and significant. It was a resounding yes to the possibilities of the human spirit to speak truthfully and wisely and compassionately about our misery and our grandeur as the extraordinary creatures we are. Amidst all of his brilliance, there was consistently a sense of humility and awe. At a time of great personal dislocation in his life, a time of grief, he discovered the saying of the 19th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who said that each one of us lives our life forward, inevitably, in anticipation. We understand our lives only retrospectively, only by looking back. We look back today on Jim's remarkable life, and we glimpse some of the grace that was given to him. We all know of his brilliance as an editor, the feisty David, taking on the Goliaths of New York and Washington and Los Angeles' dominant newspapers, and noting that by doing so, he helped rescue them from their ingrown dullness and complacency. His words. We know that he knew nothing at all about the ins and the outs of television production, or even owned a personal computer. Went on to pioneer changes in television and electronic news media. We know that he spotted and encouraged some of the leading journalistic talents of our time, that he was able to help them bring forth into the air of the routine new ways of reporting and observing. But we know, too, that looking back on his own life, with all of its high moments of elation and satisfaction, and its down times of pain and loss, that he cared deeply most about his family. And they grasped that care and love from him. Amelia, Priscilla, Felicia, Michael, Justine cherish him as father and mentor. And his dear wife, Kevin, fun companion, gifted helpmate, listening poet, gave him so very much, and she received so very much in return. And humor graced their lives. Once when my wife Claire was visiting Kevin during her convalescence, Jim was sitting there at her bedside, resigned, and they just said, "Now there she is, and she's supposed to be taking care of me, and here I am." Jim was greatly a moral man. He was not moralistic in any narrow sense of the word. He welcomed us all. And his service was, I believe, rooted in something that was deeper than himself. It sprang from his inmost private self and his quiet relationship with his Creator. Jim wrote, "My mother remembers my talking to her during my college years about becoming a minister. Well, journalism for me became a kind of therapy. And indeed it did. He cared about justice among people. He cared about mercy. He stood beside the underdog, the oppressed, the marginalized, the obscure. As a young journalist, he took on the Ku Klux Klan in their hard time, and they retaliated in obscene ways, but it did not deter him. He sought to tell the stories of men and women in the great city whose lives were marked by indifference, callousness, indifference to their schools, housing, health, or any recourse to fair judicial processes. And he touched my life. And he touched the lives of many other clergy, probably without knowing it at all. Karen didn't know about this instance that was reported in one of the recent obituaries until she read it, poured it out. But I remember it touched my life and the life of the mainstream church in an indelible way. In April 1963, a young minister from Georgia was incarcerated in a jail in Alabama. He was there because he had incited public disturbance, protesting the legally constituted edifice known as segregation. Some of his sympathetic white clergy brothers urged this young pastor to be patient, to rely upon the slow processes of judicial resources, to call off these public demonstrations, which might only exacerbate the suffering of the protesters. But the young preacher replied to them in a letter written from his cell that he could and would. Jim, who was then editing the New York Herald Tribune, which most of us refer to as the late lamented Herald Tribune, saw a copy of this letter. He put it on the front page of the paper. And by doing so, Jim rescued that letter from obscurity. Mainline Christian and Jewish religious leaders who had avoided taking public stances were suddenly stung by those words. The conscience of the religious leadership of this country was moved. And for the first time since that ill-fated religious community's push for prohibition, they began to put a moral force behind the call for racial justice in this country. They lobbied, they did everything, they split churches, but they did it. I was a young clergyman serving a very small congregation, and I remember the impact of Martin Luther King's Jr. letter from a Birmingham jail. Along with others, became part of the movement to march for nonviolent change. Jim had cast a stone into the lake, and the ripples from that stone touched so many of us, and in their own way helped to move this country toward fulfilling its rightful destiny of casting aside barriers to all its citizens. Those of us who later saw his work in the late Herald Examiner remember how he pursued the outrageous treatment of a black woman who was shot by the police point blank because they were there to help collect $29 in back payment owed to the gas company. It was an outrage, but it was ignored until Jim put it on the front page of the Herald Examiner and kept printing articles about it day in and day out. And then people in the wider community who knew nothing about these kinds of events because they had never read it and reported it, but streetcar people had known for years, he made public. That led to reform. Jim didn't just